My name is Megan, and I want to tell you a story that changed my life forever. It happened last year at our school, an ordinary American high school in a small town. Our town was so quiet and peaceful that it was hard to imagine anything terrible could happen here. It all started on a regular Friday morning. I was a senior, and this day was supposed to be one of those when we were all looking forward to the weekend. But that Friday, something strange happened. When I arrived at school, I felt a certain tension in the air. I thought it was just nerves before an important biology test. The first thing that alarmed me was the disappearance of our biology teacher, Mr. Henderson. No one had seen him since the morning, and the class was canceled. We just sat in the classroom waiting for news. Finally, the principal announced that Mr. Henderson hadn't come to work and another teacher would take his place. It was odd, but not enough to cause panic. The whole day passed in anxiety. The feeling that something was about to happen didn't leave me. After classes, I went to the library to get some books for test preparation. The library was almost empty. Only the old librarian, Mrs. Collins, was sitting at her desk. I chose the books and approached the desk, but Mrs. Collins looked unusually tense. She cautiously looked up when I got closer. "Megan," she said quietly, "be careful this evening. Don't stay at school after classes." I was surprised, but decided not to ask more. I took the books and left the library. The strange feeling didn't leave me, but I tried not to pay attention to it. After school, my friends Lisa and Jason and I planned to stay at school to prepare for a school event next week. We went to the old storage room where decorations and costumes were kept. This storage room was in the back wing of the school, and students rarely went there. When we got there, it was already late, and the corridors were empty. Lisa opened the storage room door, and we went inside. It was immediately clear that something was wrong. Broken decorations were scattered on the floor, and there was an unpleasant smell of decay in the air. "What the—" Lisa began, but I interrupted her. "Let's do everything quickly and get out of here," I said, trying not to show my fear. We started sorting through the decorations, looking for what we needed. Jason found an old box and began pulling out costumes. Suddenly he stopped and stared at one of the boxes. "Hey Megan, look at this," he called me. I went over to him and saw an old, tattered book. It was covered in dust and looked very old. There were no inscriptions on the cover, only strange symbols that I couldn't recognize. "Is this some old textbook?" I asked. "I don't know, but it looks weird," Jason replied, opening the book. The pages were filled with strange drawings and incomprehensible texts. Lisa also came closer to take a look. "Maybe it's some ancient spell book," she joked, but there was unease in her voice. We began flipping through the pages, and suddenly the light in the room started flickering. I felt a chill down my spine, but decided it was just a coincidence. "Maybe we should leave this and go home," I suggested, but Jason was too interested in the book. "Look at this," he said, pointing to one of the pages. On the page was an illustration of some ritual, and under the drawing was an inscription in a strange language. We couldn't read it, but we felt it was something important. "Let's try reading it aloud," Jason suggested. "Are you crazy? It could be dangerous," Lisa protested. "It's just an old inscription. What could happen?" Jason replied and began reading. As soon as he uttered the first words, the room filled with cold air. The light flickered even more, and I felt my heart beat faster. Jason continued reading, and suddenly we heard a strange noise, like someone rustling behind the wall. "Stop, Jason!" I screamed, but it was too late. The room was enveloped in darkness, and I felt myself being pulled somewhere. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The feeling was horrible. I didn't know where I was or what was happening around me. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I was in some strange place. It was the same room, but everything was distorted, and the colors looked weird. Jason and Lisa were also there, but they looked like they had seen ghosts. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered. "I don't know, but we need to find a way out," I replied. We started looking for doors, but they had disappeared. All exits were closed, and we were trapped in this strange, terrible room. Suddenly, we heard footsteps. Someone was approaching us. It was a figure in a black cloak, and their face was covered with a hood. "Who are you?" I asked, but there was no response. The figure kept coming closer, and I felt my heart freeze with fear. Suddenly, it stopped and raised its hand. I felt myself being lifted into the air and thrown against the wall. Pain shot through my body, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Lisa and Jason were sitting next to me, and they didn't look any better than I did. "What happened?" I asked. "We don't know," Lisa replied, "but we were all found unconscious in the old storage room. No one knows what really happened." We tried to forget about this incident, but it was impossible. The darkness we felt that evening stayed with us forever. We never talked about it again, but every time I passed by that storage room, I felt like something was watching me from the darkness. This was the story that changed our lives, and even now, a year later, I can't forget what we went through. The darkness in high school left its mark, and no one can explain what it really was. My name is Mark, and this story happened to me in high school, in a small town in New Jersey. The memories of those events still haunt me, and I want to share them with you as a warning of potential dangers. It happened during my sophomore year. Our school was an old building, erected back in the 50s. It had long corridors with high ceilings, where every step echoed dully. Among the students, there was a legend that a ghost of a girl who disappeared many years ago lived in the basement of the school. One of my friends, Sarah, was very curious and always looking for adventures. One day, she suggested that we go down to the basement after classes and check if there was anything supernatural there. Several of our friends agreed to go with us: Tom, Lisa, and Nate. We waited until the evening when the school was empty and headed to the basement. The descent was long and dark, and the old stairs creaked under our feet. When we finally reached the bottom, we were met by dead silence and cool air that felt heavy and viscous. The basement was a huge labyrinth with narrow corridors and numerous rooms. We moved forward, lighting the way only with flashlights. In one of the corridors, we came across old cabinets filled with documents that seemed to have been untouched for many years. Sarah suddenly stopped and quietly said, "Do you hear that?" We listened, and indeed there was a faint crying sound coming from ahead. It was strange and eerie. We hesitated, but Sarah insisted on moving forward. When we approached the source of the sound, we saw an old door with cracks and peeling paint. The crying was coming from there. Sarah cautiously opened the door and we stepped inside. The room was dark and almost empty, with only an old chair in the corner. We came closer and saw an old doll on the floor. It was worn out with torn dresses and a missing eye. Sarah picked it up and, examining it, said, "This must have belonged to that girl from the legend." Suddenly, the doll started laughing, loudly and eerily. We all jumped back, feeling a chill run down our spines. Tom tried to take the doll from Sarah, but she suddenly threw it away as if burned. Then the light in our flashlight started flickering, and we heard heavy footsteps in the corridor outside the door. Nate rushed to close the door, but it wouldn't budge. From around the corner, a figure appeared, tall, dark, and blurry, with shining eyes that seemed bottomless. We began to retreat, feeling the fear paralyze our legs. The figure was approaching, its steps becoming louder and heavier. Lisa started crying, and I felt my heart pounding in my throat. Sarah seemed to be in shock, but she suddenly pulled herself together and shouted, "Run!" We ran towards the exit, not looking back. The corridor seemed endless, and the figure's footsteps relentlessly followed us. When we finally reached the stairs, I felt something cold and wet grab my leg. I fell, but Nate quickly picked me up, and we scrambled upstairs together. When we burst onto the surface, the school seemed empty and safe. We no longer heard the footsteps, but everyone was in a panic. Tom suggested we go home immediately and never return to the basement. We agreed. The next day at school, none of us mentioned what had happened. We tried to behave normally, but fear lingered in each of us. No one dared to go down to the basement again, and the legend of the ghost remained not just a story, but a frightening reality for us. Years have passed, but I still remember those events. I try not to think about it, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear those same heavy footsteps and the doll's quiet laughter. Perhaps the basement of our school holds many more secrets, but I no longer want to be a part of them. My name is Michael, and I want to tell you a story that happened to me during my senior year in high school. This event changed my life forever, and I will never forget the fear I felt then. I attended an old high school in a small town in Ohio. The school had a rich history, built back in the 1920s. There were rumors that it was cursed, but we, the students, laughed it off. However, everything changed in the fall of my senior year. It all started on a typical Monday. I arrived at school and noticed that a few of my classmates looked unusually nervous. They were talking about strange sounds they heard coming from the school's basement. Naturally, I paid no attention to this, thinking it was just another prank to scare the freshmen. But with each passing day, the rumors grew louder. Classmates said they saw shadows in the corridors, heard whispers when no one was around. Even the teachers began to look worried, though they didn't openly admit it. One evening, staying after school for extra classes, I decided to check out the basement. Along with two friends, Tom and Sam, we headed to the basement. The doors were old and creaky, like in horror movies. We gathered our courage and went down. The basement turned out to be large and maze-like. Old furniture, dust, and cobwebs made it a truly eerie place. We began exploring the rooms one by one when we suddenly heard a strange sound, like whispering. We stopped, listening. The whispering grew louder and more distinct. It seemed to be calling us to one of the rooms. When we entered that room, we saw an old portrait hanging on the wall. The portrait of a woman, a teacher from the last century. Below it was a note. "Do not wake her." Naturally, we thought it was someone's prank and started laughing, but the laughter quickly faded when the portrait fell from the wall, shattering the glass on the floor. Suddenly, we heard a loud creak of the door behind us. We turned around and saw that the door through which we had entered had closed by itself. The air grew cold, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Sam approached the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. We began to panic. Tom suggested finding another way out, and we continued exploring the basement. As we walked through the dark corridors, we heard strange sounds. Footsteps, whispers, even children's laughter. But there was no one around. Finally, we found another room where we discovered an old diary. It detailed how the teacher, whose portrait we had seen, went missing after several students complained about her cruelty. The diary described rituals and curses she performed to take revenge on those who caused her pain. We realized that the curse was real, and we had awakened it. At that moment, the lights went out, and we were plunged into complete darkness. Panic engulfed us. I felt someone touch my shoulder, but when I turned around, there was no one there. We ran, trying to find an exit. Tom shouted that he saw light ahead, but when we got there, it was just a reflection in a mirror. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, and we saw a horrifying image. The figure of a woman with dark eyes and long hair, reaching out to us. We fled and eventually found an exit to the surface. As we ran into the fresh air, the feeling of horror didn't disappear. Tom and Sam swore they would never return to that school, and I understood them. We told our parents and the school administration about what had happened, but no one believed us. However, that night I heard whispers in my room and felt someone watching me. Since then, I have never slept peacefully. The following week, a fire broke out at the school, destroying part of the basement. Everyone talked about it as an accident, but I knew it wasn't. I still hear those whispers when I'm alone in the dark, and I know the curse hasn't gone away. It lives somewhere nearby, waiting for its time to awaken again. This story serves as a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Sometimes the unknown is best left alone because it can bring more trouble than we can imagine. My name is Emily, and I want to share with you a story that forever changed my life. It happened last year when I was a senior in a small-town high school in Ohio. In our town, there were always legends about the old abandoned school that stood on the edge of the forest. It had been closed for over 20 years due to strange and unexplained incidents that occurred there. Students went missing, teachers spoke of ghosts, and some even claimed to have seen strange shadows in the windows. One evening, my friend Mike suggested we go there and see if any of it was true. I had always been curious to learn more about that school, but at the same time I felt scared. However, curiosity won, and we set off together with Mike, Kate, and Tom. We arrived at the school around midnight. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the dilapidated building. The windows were boarded up, but the front door was slightly ajar. We went inside and immediately felt the cold breath of death. The walls were covered in graffiti, and debris from furniture was strewn everywhere. The first thing that struck us was the feeling of being watched. I turned around but saw no one. We decided to split up to explore the place more quickly. I went to the old gym. Kate and Tom headed to the library, and Mike stayed on the first floor, exploring the classrooms. The gym looked as if no one had been there for many years. Old basketball hoops hung from broken stands, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw a silhouette. It was Mike. He said he had heard strange sounds and decided to check if everything was okay. We decided to continue exploring together. We went up to the second floor where, according to legend, students had disappeared. There was an old music room. When we entered, I felt a strong chill. We heard a quiet, almost inaudible sobbing. It was a sound that made my hair stand on end. We started looking for the source of the sound and found an old piano. Mike opened the lid, and the sound stopped. We decided to move on, but the door suddenly slammed shut with a crash. We were left in the dark. Mike started banging on the door, but it wouldn't open. I felt panic rising inside me. We heard footsteps behind the door, and suddenly it opened. It was Tom, who had seen that we hadn't returned for a long time and decided to look for us. We decided we had enough and needed to leave. But as we were going down the stairs, Mike suddenly disappeared. We started looking for him, but couldn't find him anywhere. His phone was off and we didn't hear a sound. We decided to go back to the entrance and call for help. Kate called the police, but they told us they couldn't help because the school was officially closed and entry was prohibited. We went back inside, hoping to find Mike ourselves. We searched for almost an hour until we heard his scream from the basement. We rushed there and saw that the basement door was open. We entered and saw Mike sitting in the corner, covered in blood. He kept repeating the same thing. "She's coming for me. She's coming for me." We grabbed him and started to climb the stairs, but suddenly heard a woman's voice whispering our names. It was the scariest thing I had ever heard. The voice echoed from everywhere and seemed to penetrate my soul. We started running. Mike suddenly resisted, screaming that he couldn't leave, that she wouldn't let him go. We forcibly dragged him out of the building and ran to the car. We drove away from that place without looking back. Mike kept repeating the same words, and Kate tried to calm him down. When we finally reached the town, we stopped near the hospital. Mike was hospitalized, but he never came to his senses. The doctor said he had experienced severe stress, but they couldn't determine the cause of his condition. We returned to the school once more, but this time with the police. They searched the building but found nothing. No traces of blood, no evidence of our ordeal. They told us it might have been our imagination, but we knew the truth. Since then, I've tried to avoid places where something similar could happen, but I always remember that night and the horrors we experienced, and every time I pass by the old school, I feel it's still waiting for new visitors, ready to release its ghosts once again. My name is Scott, and this story happened to me at Riverdale High School in a small town on the east coast of the USA. It was a few years ago, but I still can't forget the horrors I experienced. Sometimes I even think this story is still ongoing. I was an ordinary high school student, nothing special. I had average grades, a few friends, but I wasn't popular. We often gathered after school to play basketball or video games. The town was quiet, and everyone knew everyone. But that summer changed everything. It all started when our school got a new history teacher. His name was Mr. Gray. He was mysterious and always wore a dark suit. His eyes seemed so cold and ruthless that anyone who met his gaze felt a chill run down their spine. Mr. Gray often talked about ancient rituals and cults I had never heard of before. At first it seemed just interesting, but with each lesson his stories became more and more eerie. One day when my friends and I were playing basketball on the school playground, I noticed Mr. Gray standing nearby, watching us. His gaze was so focused that I felt something shift inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more about me than I did. The next day, strange things began to happen at school. First, a few books disappeared from the library. Then one of our classmates, Jacob, went missing. The police searched for him, but to no avail. This was just the beginning. One evening I stayed at school after classes to prepare for a history test. I heard strange noises coming from the basement. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. The basement was always locked, but this time the door was ajar. I went downstairs and saw Mr. Gray standing by an ancient altar surrounded by candles. He was muttering something in an unknown language. I realized I had stumbled upon something terrible when I saw his eyes glowing red. I backed away, but it was too late. Mr. Gray noticed me. He grabbed my arm and dragged me to the altar. His strength was incredible. I couldn't resist. He told me about an ancient cult that sought victims for its rituals. He said he had already taken Jacob and that I would be next. I gathered all my strength and broke free from his grip. I ran without looking back until I burst out of the basement. I knew I had to do something, but whom could I trust? Everyone at school seemed suspicious to me. I decided to go to the police, but they didn't believe my story. They thought it was just childish fantasies. But I knew Mr. Gray was a real threat. One evening, as I was walking home, I felt someone following me. It was Mr. Gray. I knew I had to do something to save my life. I gathered my friends and told them everything. They were scared but decided to help me. We returned to the school at night and sneaked into the basement. We found Mr. Gray and tried to stop his ritual. It was terrifying, but we were determined. We managed to break the altar and free the souls of those he had taken. After that night, Mr. Gray disappeared. No one knew what happened to him. The police never found him, but I knew he wouldn't return. We were all scared but relieved it was over. However, every time I see a dark suit or hear whispers in an unknown language, I remember Mr. Gray and the horrors we endured. This story will forever remain in my memory as a terrifying nightmare from which there is no waking up. But the story didn't end there. A few months after Mr. Gray's disappearance, new strange events began. Students started disappearing again. No one could explain what was happening. Everyone thought it was a coincidence, but I knew it was a continuation of the same horror. One day, I found a note in my locker. It said, "You're next." I realized Mr. Gray or someone from his cult had returned. I decided not to wait to become a victim. I gathered my friends, and we headed to the basement to find answers. We found a new altar, even more sinister than the previous one. Around it were photos of the missing students. I felt fear growing inside me, but I knew I had to act. We began breaking the altar, but suddenly Mr. Gray appeared. He was even more terrifying than before. His eyes glowed with a red fire, and he started whispering curses. We fought him, but he was very strong. In the end, we managed to destroy the altar and free the souls of the missing students. Mr. Gray disappeared in a cloud of smoke, leaving only darkness behind. We ran out of the basement and never returned there again. After that incident, the school closed and we moved to another town. But I will always remember the horrors I experienced at Riverdale High School, and every time I see a dark suit or hear whispers in an unknown language, I remember Mr. Gray and the horrors we endured. This story will forever remain in my memory as a terrifying nightmare from which there is no waking up. Now, as I tell this story, I feel a cold fear enveloping me. I hope this never happens again, but part of me knows that evil will always find a way to return. Maybe not today, not tomorrow, but someday it will return, and then I will have to fight for my life again. My name is Mark Smith, and I am a student at Riverwood High School. Our school isn't particularly special, regular classes, regular teachers, regular students. But if someone were to ask me what the scariest thing about our school is, I would answer without hesitation: the night shift. At our school, there is a strange tradition. Each year, one student from each class is chosen for night duty. Although we have a modern security system and surveillance cameras, the night shift is conducted to teach responsibility. That's how the teachers explain it. But to me, it only brings fear. At the beginning of the school year, the principal announced that I had been selected for the night shift. At first, I thought it was a joke, but when I was handed the keys to the school and a detailed schedule of duties, it became clear it was no joke. My first shift was scheduled for Friday. It was the longest day of the week since we also had extracurricular activities after classes. I stayed at school until late in the evening, waiting for everyone else to leave the building. When the last student left, I locked the main doors and turned on the alarm. The school immediately plunged into silence. Only the faint light from the lamps illuminated the corridors. I started my rounds from the first floor, checking each room to make sure everything was in order. The first few hours passed without incident. I sat in the security room, watching the surveillance footage. The feeling of unease grew. At midnight, when I was about to make another round, I noticed something strange on the monitor. A shadow appeared in the corridor on the third floor. It could just be a technical glitch, I thought, trying to calm myself. But fear had already gripped me. I decided to check what was happening. Going up to the third floor, I carefully examined the corridor. It was dark and quiet. Only the sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty space. Suddenly, I heard a rustle. Turning around, I saw that the door to the old biology lab was slightly open. Panic surged through me. I knew that these doors should be locked since the lab was no longer in use. Gathering all my courage, I approached the door and opened it wider. The lab was empty. At first glance, as I took a step inside, I heard a faint sound, as if someone was whispering my name. Mark. I froze in place. My heart raced and the air grew heavy. Where was this sound coming from? Who was calling me? Feeling on the verge of a nervous breakdown, I decided to return to the security room. But as soon as I took a step back, the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the lights in the lab started flickering, and I saw a shadow moving along the wall. The shadow looked human, but something was off. It was too tall and distorted. I could hear it whispering my name, getting closer and closer. Mark. Mark. I couldn't believe my eyes. This shadow was approaching me. Panic gripped me. I started looking for a way out, but all the doors were locked. The shadow was already very close, and I felt its cold breath on my skin. At the last moment, when I was sure it was the end, the lights came back on, and the shadow disappeared. The door opened, and I wasted no time running out of the lab. Returning to the security room, I saw on the monitors how the shadow was chasing me through the school corridors. I could no longer stay there. I turned off the alarm and ran outside, leaving the school behind. The next day, I told the principal what had happened. He listened to me carefully but didn't believe me. No one did. Since then, I refused to do night shifts and never stayed at school after sunset. Several years have passed since then, but I still remember that night. Every time I pass by the school, I feel a cold breath on my skin and hear the whisper calling me from the darkness. Mark. Mark. I never thought that my last summer in high school would be so terrifying. My name is Brian, and this is the story of my final weeks at Franklin High School. I had always been a typical student, not particularly standing out and never having any problems with my studies. But what happened changed me forever. It was a regular Monday when I arrived at school. Everyone was talking about the new corridor that had been opened in the old part of the building. It had been closed for several years due to renovations, and none of us knew what had happened there. Rumors circulated that ghosts were hiding there, but my friends and I just laughed it off. My best friends, James and Sarah, decided that we should go there after classes and see what was really going on. I wasn't too keen on the idea, but their enthusiasm was contagious. After classes, we quietly made our way to the closed corridor. It was long and dark, with old wooden doors on both sides. The doors creaked as we opened them one by one, but all the rooms were empty. When we reached the end of the corridor, we saw another door that looked different. It was covered in old engravings and had a large lock. To our surprise, the door was open. James pushed it, and we entered. Inside was a small room with a flickering lamp. In the center stood an old desk, and photos hung on the walls. We started examining them, and I suddenly noticed that all the faces in the photos were crossed out. Sarah found an old book on the desk and began to flip through it. It was written in a strange language we couldn't understand. Suddenly, the lamp went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. We heard creaking sounds and felt cold breaths on our necks. My heart was pounding, and I could hardly breathe from fear. James tried to turn on the flashlight on his phone, but it wouldn't work. We heard voices whispering something incomprehensible to us. My mind refused to accept what was happening, but the fear was real. We ran to the door, but it suddenly slammed shut in front of our noses. I felt cold hands grabbing my shoulders. We screamed and banged on the door, but it wouldn't open. The voices grew louder, and I began to understand some words. Stay. Forever. Suddenly the door flew open, and we ran out of the room without looking back. We sprinted down the corridor like madmen, and finally found ourselves in the light. We were panting heavily and couldn't say a word. After that, we never spoke about what happened in that corridor again. The next day, we found out that the corridor had been closed again for renovations. None of the teachers wanted to talk about what had happened there, and everyone looked at us suspiciously. James, Sarah, and I decided we would never return to that part of the school. But sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear those same voices whispering in my ear, and I know they're waiting for me. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget about that incident. However, strange things started happening at school. Students began to disappear. At first, it was just rumors, but then we realized it was true. Every week, 1 or 2 students wouldn't come to class, and no one knew where they might be. One day during lunch, Sarah came up to me. She looked worried and told me that her brother, who also attended this school, had disappeared the night before. She said she heard strange sounds coming from his room, and when she went in, he was already gone. James and I decided to help her investigate. We returned to that sinister corridor. The doors were open again, even though we clearly remembered them being closed. There was a strange chill in the air. We went back into that room and saw new photographs on the desk. This time they depicted the students who had disappeared. Their faces were also crossed out. We started examining the book Sarah had found earlier. It turned out to be a diary written by an old teacher at this school. From his records, we learned that he had been performing dark rituals with the students, hoping to gain eternal life. But something had gone wrong, and he had become a victim of his own rituals. We began to understand that this teacher had become a spirit, now capturing students to complete his ritual. We decided to destroy the book, thinking it would stop him. James lit a match, and we set the diary on fire. It burned quickly, but suddenly the room filled with thick smoke, and we heard a piercing scream. We ran out of the room, but the corridor started to change. The walls became narrow, and it seemed like they were moving. We barely escaped and ran to the principal, telling him everything that had happened. At first, he didn't believe us, but when he saw how we looked, he decided to take action. The school was closed indefinitely. All the students were evacuated, and investigations began. James, Sarah, and I were safe, but I still hear those voices at night. Sometimes I think they're getting closer. I'm afraid that one day they'll come for me. This story taught me one thing. You shouldn't play with dark forces that you don't understand. Even the most innocent curiosity can lead to terrible consequences. And now I know that some doors are better left unopened. My name is Thomas, and I am a senior in a typical American high school. At first glance, our school is no different from others. Standard classrooms, noisy hallways, teachers trying to impart knowledge to students. But recently, something happened in our school that changed everything. It all started in early October when we were preparing for the traditional Halloween school dance. This event was always popular among students, and each class competed for the right to organize the best party. This year, it was our class's turn. One day, we decided to clean up the old gymnasium where the dance was to be held. During the cleaning, I stumbled upon an old chest hidden behind stacks of old chairs and tables. The chest was covered in dust and looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Curiously, I opened it and found an old tape recorder and several cassettes inside. One of them was labeled "Mysterious Dance." I called my friends over, and we decided to listen to the cassette. Strange music emanated from the old tape recorder, eerie melodies that made our hair stand on end. We laughed, deciding it was just an old Halloween tape, and didn't give it much thought. After that incident, strange things started happening. One of our friends, Jeremy, who was the main organizer of the dance, disappeared without a trace. At first, we thought he had just decided to skip school, but when he didn't show up the next day and didn't answer his phone, we started to worry. The next evening, we gathered in the gym to continue preparing for the dance. Suddenly, we heard the familiar melody. It was the same music from the cassette. We decided that someone had turned on the tape recorder again and went to check. But when we reached the place where the cassette had been, it was broken, and the tape recorder was off. We began to panic. Something was wrong. Strange sounds continued to echo from all corners of the gym. One by one, my friends started disappearing. First Jenny, then Mike. They all vanished without a trace. I was left alone, surrounded by the eerie music and darkness. I decided to leave the gym and call for help, but the doors were locked. I tried to find another way out, but every time I approached an exit, I ended up in the same place where it all started, next to the old tape recorder. The music grew louder and more eerie. I felt it penetrating my thoughts, making me move to the beat. I started dancing as if my legs were moving on their own. My movements became more and more uncontrollable, and the music louder. I tried to scream, but the sound of my screams blended with the eerie melodies. I don't remember how long I danced. It could have been hours, days, or even weeks. I felt myself losing consciousness, but my body kept moving. Finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, I collapsed to the floor and the music stopped. When I came to, I found myself in a hospital. The doctors said they found me on the gym floor, but my friends were never found. No one believed me when I told them about the eerie music and my friends' disappearances. Since then, I haven't been able to sleep peacefully. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that same eerie music and see my friends dancing in the darkness. I try to forget about it, but it's impossible. The music continues to play in my head, reminding me of those terrible events. Our school closed down after those disappearances. The gym was blocked off, and no one dares to go there anymore. But I know that the old tape recorder is still there, and the eerie music continues to play, waiting for new victims. My story is a warning to anyone who might find those old cassettes. Don't listen to them. Don't try to find out what lies behind them, because if you do, you may never come back. My name is Brandon, and I want to share with you a story that changed my life forever. This event happened at our high school in a small town in Ohio. Our school always seemed like an ordinary place where nothing could happen, but that impression shattered one night. In the evening, after classes ended, my friends and I decided to stay a bit longer to prepare for the upcoming school play. I, Jason, and Sarah were the main participants in the play, and we needed to rehearse a few scenes in the school's large auditorium. The place was far from the main school building and was rarely used after school hours. That evening seemed ordinary. We laughed, joked, and of course, rehearsed. But when the clock struck 10, we noticed the school hallways became surprisingly quiet and empty. It was time to go home, but Jason suggested staying a bit longer to finish the rehearsal. "Just a few more scenes and we'll be done," he said, trying to convince us. We agreed, and that was our mistake. After half an hour of rehearsal, we decided to take a break. Jason went to the restroom and Sarah stayed on stage to go through her lines. I went to the nearest vending machine to get a soda. When I was returning to the auditorium, something made me stop. The hallway seemed strange, the lights started flickering, and I felt a cold chill in the air that I hadn't noticed before. I only heard my footsteps and breathing. Suddenly, a quiet whisper came from around the corner. It was so quiet that I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely there. I stopped and listened. The whisper repeated, and this time I heard my name. Brandon. My heart started pounding faster. I turned around but saw no one. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I returned to the auditorium, Jason wasn't there. "Jason," I called, but there was no answer. Sarah looked up from her lines and looked at me, puzzled. "Where's Jason?" she asked. "He went to the restroom, but he should have been back by now," I replied, feeling my anxiety grow. We decided to go look for him. As we walked past the classrooms, I heard that whisper again. "Brandon." It echoed behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one. Sarah noticed my reaction and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. We reached the restroom, but Jason wasn't there. It was strange because he had told us where he was going. We started checking all the classrooms one by one, but couldn't find him. Then we returned to the auditorium, hoping he was waiting for us there, but it was empty. We stood in complete darkness when suddenly the door behind us creaked shut. We turned around and saw it was locked. Sarah started to panic, and I tried to find a way to open the door, but to no avail. The lights in the auditorium started flickering, and we heard quiet laughter coming from all corners. It wasn't our friend Jason, it was something else. The laughter grew louder, and we felt the cold penetrate every cell of our bodies. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, and we were left in complete darkness. I heard Sarah quietly crying next to me. I tried to calm her down, but I felt panic taking over me. Then, in the darkness, we heard footsteps. They were heavy, slow, and coming toward us. "Who's there?" I shouted, but in response I only heard that same quiet whisper. "Brandon." "Sarah." It wasn't our imagination. Something or someone was with us in the auditorium. The footsteps got closer, and we felt the air getting colder. In the darkness, we saw a faint silhouette. It was a shadow moving toward us. We felt its presence, its anger and hatred. Sarah couldn't take it and screamed. I started screaming too, hoping someone would hear us. But there was no answer. The shadow got closer, and we felt its cold breath touch our skin. At that moment, the door suddenly opened, and we heard the voice of our teacher, Mr. Reynolds. He turned on the lights, and the shadow disappeared. We saw each other, pale with fear in our eyes. Mr. Reynolds didn't understand anything, but we couldn't explain. He helped us out of the auditorium, and we ran home without looking back. The next day, we found out that Jason hadn't returned home. Everyone was looking for him, the police, teachers, classmates, but he disappeared without a trace. Sarah and I never told anyone about that night. We knew no one would believe us. Years passed, but I still remember that shadow in the school hallway. I never returned to that school. Sarah left town too. We hope it never happens again, but the shadow in my memories doesn't let me rest. It still whispers my name in the darkness. My name is Sarah, and I'm a senior in high school in a small town in the USA. I never thought that an ordinary day at school could turn into a real nightmare. But when you're trying to find the truth, you never know what you'll uncover. Here's my story. It all started during an ordinary English literature class. We were studying Stephen King's novel, The Shining, and our teacher, Mr. Johnson, was discussing the importance of atmosphere in creating fear. His stories were always captivating, and this time was no exception. He mentioned an old legend about a ghost in our school library. I always thought it was just an urban legend, but his words made me think. They say that many years ago, in the 1960s, a student named Emily disappeared in the library while preparing for exams. She was a very smart but reserved girl. After her disappearance, many began to notice strange things. Books falling off shelves by themselves, strange noises at night. The library became a place everyone avoided after sunset. I couldn't stop thinking about this story. After class, I approached Mr. Johnson and asked him for more details. He smiled and said, "Sarah, if you really want to know the truth, you should spend a night in the library. Just be careful." It was strange advice, but I felt compelled to try. My curiosity outweighed my fear. In the evening, when the school was empty, I came to the library. Armed with a flashlight, I decided to spend the night there to see if the ghost was real. The first hour passed peacefully. I read books and tried not to think about what I was doing. But when midnight came, something strange began to happen. I heard a quiet whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the windows were closed. The whisper grew louder, and I began to panic. I got up and started walking between the rows of bookshelves. Suddenly, a book fell to the floor right in front of me. I picked it up and saw that it was an old school yearbook. On one of the pages, I saw Emily. She was standing in the middle of the library, smiling. Her eyes seemed so alive, yet there was something eerie about them. I felt like someone was watching me. Looking around, I saw no one, but the feeling didn't go away. I decided to return to my spot and continue reading, trying to calm myself. But then I heard something rustling in the corner of the room. I approached and saw that one of the bookshelves started moving by itself. It was incredibly scary. My heart was beating faster, and I felt fear engulfing me. I knew I had to leave, but something held me in place. Suddenly the lights went out, and the library plunged into complete darkness. I turned on my flashlight and saw all the books starting to move, as if an invisible force was rearranging them. I began to scream, but the sound of my scream seemed muffled. I heard someone laughing, and the laughter was very close. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized this was no joke. I started running, trying to find an exit, but the doors were locked. My flashlight illuminated the figure of a girl in old-fashioned school clothes. It was Emily. She stood and looked at me with her eerie eyes. Her face was pale and her eyes were bottomless. She started to approach me and I felt panic paralyze my body. "Why did you come here?" she whispered. Her voice was cold and lifeless. I couldn't respond. I just stood there, mesmerized. "I was looking for the truth," I barely managed to say. "The truth is, you are now one of us," Emily said, and her hand touched my face. I felt a cold that pierced me to the bone. Suddenly everything went dark, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, the library was empty. I was alone and everything looked as if nothing had happened. But I knew it was real. I felt something had changed in me. From that day on, I was never alone. I heard voices and saw shadows that haunted me. No one believed me when I talked about it. But I knew the truth. Emily took part of me with her, and now I was also part of this eerie story. My school year ended, but I never returned to the library. It became a symbol of fear and secrets that will never be fully revealed. But I will always remember that night and the ghost that changed my life forever. My name is Nicole, and I always considered myself a pretty brave girl. Our school, which we call Lincoln High, had many legends, but I never believed in those tales, until I encountered one of them. It all started on the last day of the semester. I was a senior and preparing for graduation. Parties, tests, college applications, all of this consumed all my time. That day, our basketball team won an important match, and as the captain of the cheerleading squad, I had to stay after classes to help the coach clean up the gym. It was already dark when I finished my duties. The school was quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. I was heading to the locker room when I heard a strange sound. It was something like a whisper, but I was sure no one was around. "Who's there?" I shouted, but only silence answered me. Deciding it was just my imagination, I entered the locker room. However, as I closed the door, I felt a cold breath on my neck. I turned sharply, but there was no one there. "You're just tired, Nicole," I reassured myself, trying to focus on my tasks. But the feeling of unease didn't leave me. As I left the locker room, I heard the whisper again, but this time it was clearer. It sounded as if someone was trying to tell me something, but the words were incomprehensible. I decided to check the gym again. Entering it, I saw that all the windows were closed and the doors were locked, but on the floor of the gym lay a small note. I picked it up and read, "Help me." My heart started beating faster. Who could have written this? I looked around but saw no one. Deciding it was someone's silly prank, I threw the note away and left. The next day, I told my friends about it. They just laughed and said it could have been anything, from the wind to a play of light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, I stayed after classes again to help the coach. This time, I was more alert, and again, when everyone left, I heard the same whisper. I decided to follow the sound. The whisper led me to an old closet near the gym. It was a place we rarely visited, because it was filled with old sports equipment and things that had not been used for a long time. I opened the door and went inside. It was dark and cold inside. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and began to inspect the room. On the walls were old team photos, trophies, and medals, and then my gaze stopped on one picture. It was a photograph of an old basketball team from our school. Everyone looked happy, except for one girl. She stood to the side with a sad expression on her face. Her eyes seemed empty. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned sharply, but saw no one. And then I realized the whisper was getting louder. It sounded right in my head. "Help me!" It repeated over and over. I felt that I needed to find this girl in the photo. I went to the library and found old school newspapers. From them, I learned her name was Mary Smith. She was a talented athlete but died under mysterious circumstances. She was found dead in the same gym where I heard the whisper. The official version was an accident, but among students, there were rumors that it was something else. In the following days, I continued searching for information about Mary. I talked to teachers and former students, but no one wanted to discuss it. Everyone avoided this topic as if they were afraid to say something. One evening, when I stayed late at school again, I decided to go to the gym and address Mary directly. I stood in the middle of the gym and said, "Mary, I know you're here. What do you want?" At first there was silence, but then I heard her voice. It was weak but clear. "Help me find peace." I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. "How can I help you?" I asked. And then I saw her. She stood before me, transparent, with a sad look. She said, "Find the truth," and disappeared. The next day, I continued my search. I found an old coach who worked at the school during the tragedy. He told me that Mary was bullied by her team because of jealousy over her talent. They locked her in the closet as a prank, but accidentally pushed her, and she fell, hitting her head. They got scared and decided to cover it up. This story shocked me to the core. I knew I had to tell the truth. I went to the police, and after a long investigation, the culprits were found and punished. After that, the whisper stopped. I felt that Mary had found peace, but this experience stayed with me forever. I always considered myself an ordinary high school student. My name is Ben, and I attend Ridgewood High School in a small town in Pennsylvania. The school seemed normal to me. Same classes, same teachers, same students. But everything changed the day I accidentally found an old diary in the library. The Ridgewood High School library was a large old room where students rarely appeared. That day I was looking for a book for my history paper when I noticed an old dusty book on the top shelf. It was leather-bound and had an odd appearance, as if no one had opened it for many years. Out of curiosity, I took the book and began to flip through it. It was a diary, and on the first page the name was written, Elizabeth Clark, 1965. I opened a page and began to read. The diary told the story of a girl named Elizabeth who attended Ridgewood High School over 50 years ago. Her entries were filled with joys and sorrows, but with each passing day they became increasingly eerie. She described strange things happening at school, footsteps in empty corridors, whispers coming from nowhere, and shadows appearing and disappearing. One day she wrote that she saw a ghost in the corridor near the old wing of the school. She described in detail how the ghost looked, a tall figure in old-fashioned clothes, with a face that was impossible to discern. Elizabeth was frightened but simultaneously intrigued and decided to investigate the phenomenon. As I read her entries, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, but I couldn't tear myself away from the diary. I continued reading, and it became even more horrifying. Elizabeth wrote that with each passing day, the ghost became more real, and she started to feel its presence even in her home. She described waking up at night to strange sounds and the feeling that someone was standing by her bed. From that moment on, I began to notice strange things at school. At first, they were just minor things, doors that suddenly closed by themselves or lights flickering in the corridors. But then I started hearing whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me because of the diary, but the whispers grew louder. One evening, when I stayed late at school to finish a project, I decided to check out the old wing of the school that Elizabeth wrote about. It had been closed for many years, and no students went there. But I found a way to get in through a window that was surprisingly open. The corridor of the old wing was gloomy and dusty. I walked a few steps and felt someone watching me. Suddenly, I heard a whisper so close that it seemed to be right next to my ear. I turned around but saw no one. I continued walking forward and then saw a shadow. It flickered along the wall and disappeared around the corner. I followed it, my heart beating so fast I could barely breathe. I reached the end of the corridor and saw an old door leading to the basement. It was ajar. I descended the stairs and found myself in a dark room. It was very cold, and I felt fear creeping under my skin. Suddenly I saw her, the ghost Elizabeth had described. She stood before me, and I felt my legs buckle from terror. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The ghost approached me, and I saw her face. It was contorted with pain and anger. She reached out to me, and I felt cold penetrating to my bones. Gathering all my strength, I ran. I ran without looking back, through the corridor and the window I had entered. When I burst into the schoolyard, I stopped to catch my breath and realized I no longer heard the whispers. The next day, I returned the diary to the library and swore never to go back to the old wing of the school. But I knew the story wasn't over. The ghost that haunted Elizabeth now haunted me, and I didn't know how long I could endure this horror. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I woke up to strange sounds and the sensation that someone was standing by my bed. I knew it was her, the ghost from the corridor. One day I decided to tell my friends about it, but they just laughed at me. They thought I was joking and didn't take me seriously. But one evening, when we stayed late at school, they heard the whispers themselves. It was creepy. We stood in an empty corridor when we suddenly heard a soft whisper. It echoed from all sides, and we couldn't understand where it was coming from. We tried to run, but the doors that were usually open were locked. We ran through the corridors, looking for an exit, but we always ended up in the same place. Then we saw her. The ghost stood at the end of the corridor, staring at us. We stopped, unable to move, as she started to approach. My friends, who hadn't believed in ghosts before, were in a panic. We tried the doors again, and this time they opened. We ran out of the school and never stayed late there again. After that incident, I couldn't stay at Ridgewood High School any longer. I transferred to another school, but the memories of the ghost haunted me. Every time I saw a shadow or heard a whisper, I remembered that eerie corridor and the ghost that stood at the end. And even now, as I write this story, I feel her presence. She is here next to me, and I know I can never escape her. She will stay with me forever, reminding me that there are things we cannot explain, things better left alone. My name is Michael. I'm an ordinary high school student in a typical American high school. I never thought that anything special or unusual could happen to me. But the last year in school turned out to be the worst and scariest of my life. It all started in early fall. In our school, like in many others, there are legends and scary stories. One of the most famous was the story of a ghostly girl who supposedly appears in the mirror in the old wing of the school if you say her name 3 times. Her name was Lily. They say she was a student at this school many years ago and died under mysterious circumstances. Of course, we all knew this story, but no one took it seriously. One evening, after classes, my friends and I decided to test this legend. There were 4 of us: me, Tom, Sarah, and Rachel. We went to the old wing of the school, which had not been used for a long time. It was dark and abandoned, with mold and cobwebs covering the walls. We found a mirror in an old bathroom, and laughing began to call Lily. Tom was the first to say, "Lily, Lily, Lily." We all held our breath and waited. Nothing happened. We sighed with relief and started joking about how silly we were being. But suddenly, the light in the room began to flicker, and we heard a faint whisper coming from the mirror. It was impossible, but we all heard it. We rushed to the door, but it was locked. Panic gripped us, and we began pushing the door with all our strength, trying to open it. But it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I turned and saw a girl's face with empty eyes in the mirror. She was looking straight at me. We screamed and tried to get out of the room. The light flickered even more, and the whisper grew louder. We heard Lily calling our names, and it was the most terrifying thing. Her voice was cold and merciless. Suddenly, the door opened, and we rushed into the corridor. We ran without looking back until we were safely outside the school. The next day, we decided we would never talk about what had happened. But strange things began happening to us. Tom started seeing shadows in his room that disappeared when he tried to look at them. Sarah heard voices when she was alone at home. Rachel found strange messages written on her mirror. And I began to see Lily in my dreams. She came to me every night, calling my name and laughing her cold laugh. We went to our school psychologist, but he just smiled and said it was all our imagination. No one believed us. We were alone with our fears. One evening, when I saw Lily in my dream again, I woke up in a cold sweat. She said she wanted us to return to the mirror. I understood it might be a trap, but we had no choice. We gathered again and went to the old wing of the school. When we entered the same room, the mirror was there. We stood in front of it, and I said, "Lily, we are here. What do you want?" There was no answer. Suddenly, the mirror began to tremble, and we saw Lily. She was with us, but she seemed semi-transparent. Her eyes looked straight at us. "You all belong to me," she said in a cold voice. "You called me, and now I will take you with me." We rushed to the door, but it was locked again. Lily came closer, and I felt a chill pierce my body. I understood that this was the end. We should never have called her. We made a terrible mistake. I closed my eyes, preparing for the worst. But suddenly, everything went quiet. I opened my eyes and saw that we were standing in the school corridor again. The mirror was shattered, and Lily was gone. We were alive, but the feeling of fear never left us. Since then, we never talked about Lily again. We tried to forget that terrible evening, but the fear stayed with us forever. We realized that some things are better left untouched. Sometimes it's better to leave legends alone so they don't become reality. My name is Jessica, and I'm an ordinary student at Greenfield High School. Life at school seemed calm and usual, but one day everything changed when I encountered something horrific and inexplicable. It started on an ordinary autumn day. Leaves were falling from the trees, creating orange carpets on the ground, and the air was filled with the fresh scent of winter. I was walking to school, thinking about the upcoming chemistry test, when I noticed something strange. In the backyard of the school, among the thick bushes, there was an old, almost dilapidated building that I had never seen before. Intrigued, I decided to explore it during the break. When the time came, I sneaked there unnoticed, avoiding the gazes of other students. The building looked abandoned, but something about it drew me in. I opened the creaky door and stepped inside. It was dark and cold inside, with only a faint beam of light breaking through the broken windows. Suddenly, I heard a quiet whisper. It seemed to come from all directions. I tried to find the source of the sound but saw nothing. The whisper grew louder and I felt my heart begin to race. In an instant, I saw a shadow flash in the corner of the room. Fear gripped me, and I quickly left the building. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I felt like someone was watching me. At school, I felt eyes on me, but when I turned around, no one was there. At night, I had nightmares about that old building and the shadows hiding in it. I decided to talk to my best friend Sarah about what had happened. She was skeptical but agreed to go with me to that building to check everything out. We chose a time after classes when most of the students had already gone home. When we reached the building, I felt the same cold and fear. But Sarah, on the contrary, seemed confident and even a little excited. We went inside and started exploring the premises. Suddenly, we heard the same whisper. Sarah shouted that it might be the wind, but I knew it wasn't. The whisper sounded like voices speaking in an incomprehensible language. We decided to go deeper into the building, and then we saw it. In the corner of the room stood an old mirrored wardrobe. The mirrors were dirty and dusty, but the reflections in them were clear. I saw myself, but it seemed like my reflection was moving on its own. Sarah stepped closer, and suddenly her reflection blurred, and instead of it, there appeared another figure, a tall shadow with red eyes. Sarah screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her away. We ran out of the building without looking back. For the next few days, we both tried to avoid each other, but the nightmares continued to haunt us. My mother started to notice that something was wrong with me. She suggested I talk to the school psychologist, but I knew he couldn't help me. One day, when I was home alone, I decided to return to that building again. I felt I had to understand what was happening. When I entered, I was met by the same whispers and cold. I approached the mirrored wardrobe and looked into the mirror. My reflection looked horrible. My eyes were empty and my skin was pale and gray. I realized that it wasn't just a reflection, but some evil force trying to break into our world. I began searching for a way to destroy the mirror, but I didn't have time. The shadow I had seen before appeared right in front of me. It reached out its hand to me, and I felt cold pass through my body. I couldn't move, and the whisper grew louder. My consciousness began to fade, and the last thing I remember is the red eyes looking at me from the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor in the school corridor. My classmates were staring at me in horror, and a teacher had called an ambulance. They took me to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find any physical injuries. They said it might have been a nervous breakdown, but I know the truth. I know that the shadows in the old building are still there, and they are looking for new victims. Since then, I have never gone near that building again, but every time I pass by it, I feel the same cold and hear a faint whisper. My story begins in an old American high school located on the outskirts of our town. It's an ordinary school with brick walls, wide hallways, and numerous classrooms. But among these usual attributes, there was one detail that wasn't mentioned in official documents and wasn't known to new students. It was a large mirror in an old storage room. I first heard about this mirror from friends during a break. They said it was cursed and that anyone who dared to look into it alone in the dark would see their greatest fear. At first, I laughed it off, thinking these were just made-up stories to scare the newcomers. But curiosity got the better of me, and one day after classes, I decided to go and see this mirror for myself. The storage room was in the school's basement, a place rarely visited by anyone. As I made my way there, my heart started to beat faster. The basement hallways were dark, and every sound echoed ominously. I found the door labeled service room and carefully opened it. Inside was a lot of old school equipment, and in the corner stood the mirror. The mirror was huge, with a massive wooden frame covered in cobwebs. It didn't look particularly scary, but there was a sense of unease in the air. I took a step toward it and took a deep breath. The light from my pocket flashlight reflected off the mirror, and I saw my own reflection. Nothing unusual. But when I turned off the flashlight, everything changed. In the darkness, the mirror started to flicker. At first, I saw my face, but then the reflection began to change. It showed me, but in a distorted form. I saw myself old, tormented, and terrified. Shadows moved around me, whispering. A cold feeling crept through my bones, and my fear grew. I tried to step away from the mirror, but my body felt paralyzed. It seemed like I was rooted to the spot. The reflection began to speak to me in a voice that was mine, but also alien. "You cannot escape," the reflection said. "You will see all your fears and become their slave." I struggled to break free, but I couldn't. My mind was gripped with panic. The reflection became even more horrifying. I saw my friends and family standing behind me, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in pain and fear. Finally, I gathered all my strength and broke free from the room. I ran through the basement hallways, not looking back. When I burst outside, my heart felt like it was about to explode. All the while, that terrifying voice echoed in my head. Since then, I couldn't sleep peacefully. Every night I had nightmares where I saw myself in that mirror. I tried to tell my friends, but they just laughed, thinking it was another made-up story. One day I dared to return to the basement, but the door to the storage room was locked. The school administration had banned access to it due to the danger of old equipment. I didn't know if they were aware of the curse, but it seemed like they were hiding something. Months passed, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of fear. I felt like the mirror was still haunting me. Every time I passed by a mirror in the hallway or at home, I felt a chill and saw shadows in the reflection. The final straw came when I saw my reflection in the school bathroom mirror. It changed again. I saw myself old and tormented, just like in that cursed mirror. Then I realized that this mirror was connected to all other mirrors. The curse followed me everywhere. I decided that the only way out was to destroy that mirror. After school, I sneaked into the basement with a crowbar in my hand. The door to the storage room was locked, but I found another way through the ventilation shaft. When I finally got to the room, a sense of fear and hatred overwhelmed me. I approached the mirror and raised the crowbar, but before I struck, The reflection started to emerge again. It no longer resembled me. It was something else, something grotesque and evil. I hesitated for a moment, but then I gathered all my strength and struck the mirror. The mirror shattered into thousands of pieces, and at that moment I felt a heavy burden lift from my shoulders. The shadows dispersed, and the cold vanished. I stood in the room, surrounded by shards of the mirror, feeling relief and fear simultaneously. Since that day, I no longer had nightmares or felt pursued. However, I always remember that dreadful night and that mirror. It left its mark on my life, and I will never forget the horrors it held. I am an ordinary high school student in a small town in the Midwest USA. Our school is a typical example of an American high school: large corridors, noisy students, and constant hustle and bustle. But one night changed my life forever. I never imagined that a mysterious call could lead to such terrifying events. It happened one evening when I stayed late at school after classes. I was working on a project for history class when I suddenly heard the phone ringing in the teacher's office next door. It was strange because the teacher had long gone home and the phone was ringing very persistently. Picking up the receiver, I heard a hoarse voice whispering, "You have to help me. I'm lost. It's dark in the corridors." At first, I thought it was someone's prank, but there was something in the voice that made my skin crawl. I decided to check what was happening. Gathering my things, I left the office and walked through the dark corridors of the school. The further I went, the more I felt an inexplicable fear. The corridors, which were crowded with students during the day, now seemed endless and eerie. Suddenly, I saw a shadow flash before me. "Who's there?" I asked, but there was only silence in response. I continued to move forward, trying to ignore my fear. Reaching the old wing of the school, which had not been used for a long time, I heard strange sounds, as if someone was whispering my name. I stopped and listened. The sounds grew louder and more insistent. They led me to a closed door at the other end of the corridor. Opening the door, I saw an old, dilapidated library. Books were scattered on the floor, and in the corner stood an old, dusty telephone. It looked nothing like modern phones, more like something from the last century. I approached the phone and suddenly it rang. My heart pounded, but I picked up the receiver. The same hoarse voice spoke again. "You are close, very close. Find me." I felt terrified, but curiosity overcame the fear. I continued to search the library. On the wall, I saw an old photograph of the students of our school, but from the last century. Among them, I recognized a face. It was the same teacher whose voice spoke through the phone. I realized that I needed to find more information about this person. In the school archives, I found a newspaper article that said this teacher had disappeared many years ago. He was searched for, but never found. The next day, I decided to tell my friends everything. At first, they didn't believe me, but they agreed to help. We returned to the old library and began to look for additional clues. One of my friends found an old diary in which the teacher described his experiments with telepathy and communication with the afterlife. Reading the diary, we learned that the teacher was trying to find a way to communicate with the souls of deceased students. He believed he could help them find peace. But something went wrong, and he himself got trapped between worlds. We decided that we had to free his soul. Finding an old book of spells, we performed a ritual in the library. At the moment we finished, the phone rang again. I picked up the receiver and heard, "Thank you. Now I am free." Since then, the phone no longer rang. But every time I walk past the old library, I feel a chill down my spine. Sometimes I think I hear whispers, but I quickly brush off these thoughts. Our town has become quiet and peaceful again, but I will always remember that eerie night and the lost call that changed everything. A few weeks after this incident, strange things began to happen at our school. Students began to notice shadows appearing in dark corridors that could not belong to living people. Some heard whispers reminiscent of the teacher's voice. One evening, I stayed at school later than usual to finish a project. As I was leaving the building, I was stopped by a girl named Sarah. She was a younger student, but everyone knew her because of her strange behavior. Sarah said she also heard the call and the teacher's voice, but was afraid to tell anyone. We decided to find out what was happening together. In the evening, we returned to the school and went to the library. As soon as we entered, the phone rang again. This time I let Sarah pick up the receiver. Her face turned pale when she heard the voice asking for help. Sarah explained that her brother had disappeared many years ago when he was a student at this school. She always felt that his disappearance was related to something supernatural. We decided to find more information about the missing students. After spending a lot of time in the archives, we discovered that several students had disappeared without a trace over the past 100 years. All these cases had common features. The students disappeared while working on school projects, leaving only mysterious traces behind. We found another old diary belonging to one of the missing students. He described strange visions and feelings as if someone was watching him. The diary also mentioned rituals similar to those performed by the teacher. Understanding that we were on the right track, we decided to perform the ritual again, but this time with additional protective measures. We created a circle of salt and lit candles, trying to contact the spirits of the missing students. During the ritual, we felt a cold wind pass through the library. The shadows on the walls began to move, and we heard whispers growing louder. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the spirit of one of the missing students. He told us that the teacher tried to use telepathy for his experiments, but instead, he accidentally opened a portal to another dimension, where he got trapped and pulled other students with him. We realized that this portal needed to be closed to free their souls. We completed the final part of the ritual, and the spirits began to disappear, thanking us for the help. A sense of relief filled the library, and the cold wind disappeared. Since then, there have been no more strange occurrences at the school. Students stopped seeing shadows and hearing whispers. Sarah and I realized that we had saved not only the missing students, but also ourselves from further dangers. The town returned to its usual rhythm, but I will always remember those eerie events and the lost call that changed everything. Sometimes I wonder what other secrets our school might be hiding, and whether there are other mysteries waiting to be uncovered. But one thing is for sure, I will never stay late at school after dark again. I am an ordinary high school student in an American high school located in a small town. We moved here a few years ago, and I quickly found new friends. We had our own group, me, Megan, Tim, and Kevin. We always spent time together, and one day we decided to explore the abandoned old school, about which many eerie legends were told. The old school was on the outskirts of the town. It had been closed many years ago under mysterious circumstances. They said strange things happened there, children disappeared without a trace, and teachers heard strange noises at night. No one knew what caused the school to close, but it became a place where no one dared to enter. One evening, when all our parents were at work, we decided to go there. It was Tim's idea, and although we were all scared, no one wanted to look like a coward. We took flashlights and set off to the old school. When we approached the building, it looked even scarier than I had imagined. Broken windows, peeled walls, and everything covered in a thick layer of dust. We stood in front of the door, and no one dared to take the first step. But Tim, as always, took the initiative and opened the door. They creaked open, and we entered inside. Inside, it was dark and cold. The flashlights barely dispersed the darkness, and we saw empty classrooms with broken furniture. We walked through the corridors, and every step echoed loudly. In one of the classrooms, we found old notebooks and textbooks left by the students. All these things seemed so ordinary, but in this context, they looked eerie. Megan found an old diary that belonged to a girl named Emily. She started reading it aloud, and we learned that Emily was one of those who disappeared. The last entries in her diary were about hearing strange voices and seeing shadows in the school. During our journey, we started hearing strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, as if someone was walking through the corridors. We tried to calm ourselves, convincing ourselves that it was just the wind or old building materials, but each sound made us more and more tense. On the second floor, we came across an old laboratory. All the glass jars and test tubes were broken, and there were remnants of some liquids on the floor. It was even scarier here. Kevin found an old chemistry teacher's notebook that wrote about strange experiments conducted at the school. Suddenly, we heard a loud creak of the door. We turned around and saw that the laboratory door was closed. Tim tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to grip us. We started hearing more strange sounds, as if someone was walking behind the walls. Megan started crying, and Kevin tried to calm her down. Tim was still trying to open the door, but without success. Then I suggested finding another way out through the window. We approached the window, but it was locked. It seemed like we were trapped. Suddenly, Megan's flashlight started flickering and went out completely. We were left in darkness, and it was the scariest thing that could happen. Tim turned on his flashlight, but its light was very weak. We saw shadows moving around us. We heard voices, whispers, calling us by name. It was terrifying. I felt someone touch my shoulder, but when I turned around, there was no one there. Megan started screaming, and it was a signal for all of us. We started running. We ran through the corridors, not knowing where to go. It was dark everywhere, and it seemed like the school had come alive. We heard footsteps behind us, as if someone was chasing us. Tim found a door that led to the basement, and we decided to go down there, hoping to find an exit. The basement was an even more eerie place. Old pipes and walls covered in mold created the impression that we were entering some other world. It was even darker here, and the sounds were getting louder. We found a door leading outside, but it was locked from the inside. Megan was in despair, and we all began to lose hope. Then Kevin suggested trying to find the key. We split up and started searching the basement. I found an old closet and decided to check it. There were old school journals and another diary of Emily. The diary mentioned a secret room in the basement where some rituals were conducted. I told my friends about it, and we decided to find this room. We walked through the narrow corridors of the basement until we found a door with strange signs on it. Tim tried to open the door, and it gave way. Inside was a small room with various strange objects, candles, old books, and amulets. In the center of the room was a large table with Latin inscriptions. We realized that this was the place where the rituals Emily wrote about were conducted. Suddenly, we heard a loud knock, as if someone was trying to open the door from the other side. We were all scared to death. Tim found a key on the table and rushed to the door. We all ran after him. He quickly unlocked the door, and we went outside. It was an incredible relief. We no longer heard strange sounds, and it seemed like the school had left us alone. We ran outside and headed home without looking back. After that incident, we never returned to the old school. We told our parents everything that happened, but they didn't believe us. They said it was just our imagination, but we knew the truth. The old school remained a creepy memory for us, and we always avoided it. Even now, when I pass by that building, I feel cold and anxious. It was a real nightmare that stayed with me forever. I study at Bluewood High School. It's a small town somewhere in the heart of the USA where everything seems calm and peaceful. But sometimes the darkest secrets hide in such places. The story began when our school librarian, Mr. Thompson, suddenly disappeared. He was old, with long gray hair and glasses perched on the tip of his nose. Always friendly and ready to help, he was one of those people who made our school special. His disappearance was a real shock to all of us. The first few days after his disappearance still seemed ordinary, but then strange things started happening. During one of our English classes, when everyone was engrossed in reading, I heard a faint whisper coming from outside the classroom door. No one else seemed to notice it. I tried to focus on my reading, but the whisper continued, growing louder and louder. It was some unknown, barely discernible murmuring. The next day, when I was passing by the library, I thought I saw a shadow flickering behind the bookshelves. I stopped and peeked inside. Nothing. Empty. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the feeling of unease remained. Each day it got worse. One evening, staying after school to prepare for exams, I decided to go to the library. The lights were off, and only the moonlight streamed through the large windows. I could hear my every step echoing loudly in the empty space. And then I heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer, as if someone was standing nearby, speaking softly. Chills ran down my spine. "Who's there?" I tried to ask, but only the echo of my voice answered. Suddenly a book fell from one of the shelves. I picked it up and saw that it was an old book of mystical stories. Opening it, I saw that one of the pages was marked in red ink. It told an old-school myth about a ghost in the library. The dusk was gradually thickening, and I felt the fear creeping in. I decided it was better to leave, but when I turned to the exit, I saw that the door was closed. It wouldn't budge, as if someone on the other side was holding the handle. Panic gripped me, and then the whisper returned, now right next to me. It was saying my name. I ran to the window, trying to open it, but it was locked. At that moment, I realized I was trapped, and then the shadow appeared. It emerged from the darkness between the shelves, formless, like smoke. It was approaching me, and I felt the cold breath of death on my skin. The whisper grew louder and clearer. "Stay with me." It repeated over and over. I tried to fight the panic, but the shadow was already very close. Suddenly, I felt the ground sway beneath my feet, and I lost consciousness. I woke up in the hospital. It turned out that the guard had found me unconscious on the library floor. No one could explain what had happened to me. But I knew the truth. The shadow of librarian Mr. Thompson, who had disappeared, had not left me. He wanted me to stay with him, forever trapped within those walls. Since that day, I never went back to the library alone, but every time I pass by its doors, I feel a cold gaze on me and hear a faint whisper coming from behind the shelves. It happened last fall when I was in high school in a small town in Michigan. The school was typical, with the usual problems and joys of teenage life. But everything changed on the day when rumors started about mysterious events in the abandoned wing of our school. Our town was small, and news spread quickly. Everyone knew that the old wing of the school, which had not been used for years, had become the site of something strange. It had been closed off due to its dilapidated condition, but there were rumors that strange shadows had been seen and eerie sounds heard there. One day after classes, my friend suggested we check out the place. At first, I didn't want to, but curiosity and the desire to show that I wasn't afraid won out. We gathered a group of 5 and headed to the abandoned wing. As we approached, we noticed that the door was broken. That was already unsettling. Inside, everything looked even worse. Broken desks, shattered windows, cobwebs on the walls. It seemed like time had stopped there. We started exploring the rooms one by one. There was nothing unusual until we reached the old chemistry lab. There we found an old notebook filled with notes. The notebook belonged to a former student who had disappeared many years ago. The notes contained strange drawings and stories about experiments conducted in this lab. One of my friends, Tom, decided to read the notes aloud. As he read, a strange tension filled the air. We heard footsteps in the hallway, although we knew there shouldn't be anyone there. Deciding to check, we stepped into the corridor and saw a shadow quickly dart past us. We hurried after it, but found nothing. Then we heard footsteps again, this time behind us. Turning around, we saw only darkness. Suddenly, Tom disappeared. We rushed to look for him, but couldn't find him anywhere. Returning to the lab, we found another part of the notebook. It described rituals that had been conducted in this room. We began to understand that this was no coincidence, A cold breath suddenly swept over our skin. We started to feel surrounded by something invisible. Each of us felt fear, but we decided to stick together and continue searching for Tom. In one of the rooms, we found an old photograph. It showed a class, but one student's face was crossed out. We realized it was the same student who had disappeared. The longer we looked at the photo, the more it seemed that the faces on it were changing. Suddenly, the door behind us closed, and we were enveloped in darkness. All we could hear was our heavy breathing. When the light finally returned, we saw that all our exits were blocked. Panic set in. We decided to return to the lab, hoping to find some clue. There we saw that one of the windows was open. We rushed to it, but as soon as one of us tried to climb out, he was pulled back. I was the last one left. The feeling of fear turned into despair. I started screaming, hoping someone would hear, but instead, I heard a familiar voice. It was Tom. He said he had found a way out and asked me to follow him. I followed his voice but realized something was wrong. The voice led me deeper and deeper into the school. Finally, I saw Tom, but it wasn't him. His eyes were empty, and he wore a creepy smile. Sensing danger, I ran back, but the hallways that had been familiar began to change. It seemed the school was alive, turning into a labyrinth. Finally, I found a door to the exit, but as soon as I opened it, I saw it wasn't an exit, but another room. I found myself in the same place where we had found the notebook. The notebook lay on the floor, surrounded by writings in blood. I realized it was a trap. After that, everything went dark. The next morning, they found me in the abandoned wing of the school. I was the only one who survived. My friends never returned, and no one knew what had happened to them. I tried to tell the police everything, but no one believed me. Since then, I live with the fear and memories of that night. Sometimes I hear voices and footsteps in the hallways, just like then. I know it's not just my imagination. The school is alive, and it will never let me go. My name is Tom. I study at a high school in a small town somewhere in Virginia. Life here was usually quite ordinary and predictable, until something happened that turned everything upside down. It all started when our school got a new student. His name was Kevin, and he moved here from his old neighborhood. He looked quite ordinary, average height, dark hair, regular clothes. But there was something about him that immediately made me feel uneasy. On the first day, he behaved quite quietly, not drawing much attention to himself. However, within a few days, strange events began to circle around him. People started disappearing, first from other classes, and then from ours. No one knew where they went. The police couldn't find any clues. One day after school, I decided to stay longer to prepare for a biology exam. I was sitting in the library when I noticed Kevin. He was standing in the corner, staring into space. I wanted to call out to him, but suddenly he turned his head, and his eyes met mine. They were cold, almost lifeless. That gaze sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I decided to talk to my friends about my suspicions. We gathered at my house after school. My friends, Sarah and Michael, had also noticed Kevin's strange behavior, but didn't think much of it at first. We decided to find out more about him. The following day, we started following Kevin. He never stayed after school, always disappearing right after the bell. One time, we saw him entering an abandoned old house near the school. We decided to follow him. The inside of the house was terrifying. Old furniture, broken windows, cobwebs everywhere. We started exploring the rooms, trying to find any clues. In the basement, we found an old diary. It belonged to a former resident of the house who had disappeared many years ago. The diary contained notes about strange rituals and dark magic. As we were reading, we heard footsteps behind the door. It was Kevin. He caught us red-handed. His eyes glowed red, and he started chanting strange words. Panic engulfed me, and I could barely move. Sarah and Michael screamed in horror. Suddenly, the room filled with darkness, and I felt the ground shake beneath my feet. Kevin uttered the final words, and we felt a cold wave of energy surrounding us. My friends vanished, leaving only their shadows on the walls. I was left alone in the darkness. I managed to escape the basement and run out of the house. I knew that returning to a normal life was no longer possible. The shadows of my friends haunted me everywhere. I felt their presence nearby. The next day, I tried to tell the teachers and the police about everything, but no one believed me. Kevin disappeared, and no one saw him again. The school remained cursed, and I felt that this was only the beginning. Every night I saw my friends in my dreams. They asked for help, but I didn't know how to help them. My mind was torn between reality and nightmares. I realized that from now on my life had turned into an endless horror. The school, which was once a place of learning and friendship, had now become my trap, a place of shadows and darkness. I always thought our town in Maine was a place where nothing ever happened. A quiet, cozy town where everyone knows each other. But that was before I realized that calmness can be deceptive. My name is Jason, and I studied at Ridgewood High School. The school is old, its brick walls preserving the memories of many generations of students. Some say the school has its own history, hidden behind thick walls and dark corridors. It all started one cool autumn evening when I was kept after school for bad behavior. I was sitting in an empty classroom when I suddenly felt that I was not alone. I turned around but saw no one. Only the shadows of the trees outside the window swayed on the walls. Time dragged on endlessly, and I decided it was time to go home. But when I stepped into the corridor, it was strangely dark and empty. Only my footsteps echoed under the old ceilings. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I looked back. No one. Must be my imagination, I thought, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I was walking towards the exit when I noticed the light in the old gym was on. This was strange because there shouldn't have been anyone there at that time. I walked closer, peeked through the window, and saw a girl standing in the middle of the gym with her head bowed. It seemed to me that she was crying. I decided to go in. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, opening the door. She turned sharply, and I saw her face. It was Susan, a girl who had disappeared 6 months ago. Everyone thought she had run away from home, but she had never been found. "Jason?" she asked softly. Her voice was weak and trembling. "Susan, what are you doing here? Everyone thinks you're missing." "They will never find me, Jason. I am here forever," she replied, and her eyes turned empty. I took a step back, but the door suddenly slammed shut behind me. I heard the key turn in the lock. Susan started approaching me, her face changing, becoming distorted and sinister. "You have to help me, Jason," she whispered, and her voice echoed in my head. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, trying to back away. "I can't leave here alone. You have to stay with me." Her hands became as cold as ice when she touched me. I felt my consciousness blurring, and it seemed that time had stopped. But suddenly, the light in the gym began to flicker, and I heard voices in the corridor. It was our teachers looking for me. The light went out, and when it came back on, Susan was gone. The door opened, and I ran out into the corridor. The teachers found me confused and scared, but I couldn't explain what had happened. After that evening, I couldn't find peace. I felt that Susan was somewhere nearby, watching me. Every time I was alone in the school, I heard her voice, her footsteps. Sometimes it seemed to me that I saw her shadow in the window reflections. One day, I decided to tell everything to my friend Tommy. He was a skeptic, but agreed to help me figure it out. We decided to stay after school and explore the building together. We wandered through the empty corridors when we heard a strange noise from the gym. Tommy insisted on going forward, although I felt something was wrong. We entered and saw the light was on again. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and we were trapped. "Susan, if you're here, show yourself," Tommy shouted, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, a cold feeling filled the air, and Susan appeared before us. Her face was gaunt, and her eyes were empty. "Tommy, Jason, you have to help me. I can't leave here alone." Her voice was quiet but determined. "What can we do?" I asked, feeling a fear that paralyzed me. "You must find the one who bound me here. Find him and make him atone for his sins." She disappeared as suddenly as she appeared. Tommy and I decided that we needed to learn more about the school's history. We spent several days going through old newspapers and archives. It turned out that many years ago, when the school had just opened, one of the teachers was involved in dark rituals. He was accused of the disappearance of several children, but no one could prove his guilt. This teacher died under mysterious circumstances, but since then, strange things began to happen in the school. We found his photo and realized he was the one who could have bound Susan's soul to this school. We decided to perform a ritual that would free her. Everything was ready, and we returned to the gym where we first saw Susan. When we began to read the words from the book, the air became cold again. Susan appeared before us, but this time she looked different. Her face was calm, and her eyes were alive. "Thank you," she whispered, and her image began to fade. Suddenly, the gym doors opened, and we saw light flooding the entire room. When it faded, Susan was gone forever. Tommy and I were exhausted but happy that we could help. Since then, Ridgewood High School has been quiet again. But I will always remember that evening when a ghost asked for help, and I will never forget Susan, who found her peace. However, after a while, I began to notice small things that disturbed me. One day I was passing by the old storeroom on the first floor and heard a faint cry. I stopped and listened. It was the cry of a child. I opened the door, but there was no one inside. Another time, during a chemistry lesson, I saw books on the shelf moving by themselves. The teacher, Mrs. Johnson, noticed it too but decided to ignore it, attributing it to vibrations from the ventilation system. I felt that Susan had returned. Maybe her soul had not found peace and she was still seeking help. One evening, when I was already at home, Tommy called me. His voice was scared. "Jason, you have to come to the school immediately. I found something," he said, and hung up. I rushed to the school and saw that all the windows of the gym were lit. I entered and saw Tommy standing with an old book in his hands. "This is the book of that very teacher. It describes all his rituals. We have to finish what we started," he said. We started reading from the book again, and suddenly the light began to flicker. Susan appeared before us again, but this time she looked even more emaciated and exhausted. "You didn't finish. I'm still here." Her voice sounded like the wind in an empty room. We realized that we needed to find and destroy the last item that held her soul. According to the book, it was an old medallion hidden in the school's basement. We went down to the basement, where it was dark and damp. The search took hours until we finally found an old box. Inside was the medallion. We knew this was what we needed. We returned to the gym and destroyed the medallion as described in the book. Suddenly, the air became warm, and we felt relief. Susan appeared before us again, but this time she looked peaceful and happy. "Thank you, now I am free," she said, and disappeared forever. Since then, strange things have no longer happened at Ridgewood High School. Tommy and I were happy we could help, but this incident remained forever in our memory.